Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today we're with returning guest and friend of the show, Alex Hochuli, co-host of Off Bunga Bunga podcast, and author at a variety of places. But the place I find you the most these days tends to be your big reviews at American Affairs. And wanted to talk to you about techno-feudalism, neo-feudalism, all the feudalisms.
Maybe not the old one. Maybe we can do the old one too.
Yeah.
Paleo feudalism.
Paleo feudalism. And yeah, I mean, even Brenner's interesting because Brenner's changed what he calls this. He used to call it neo-feudalism. Now he calls it political capitalism ? Which I also find interesting. Not to get too much into the weeds already, but I remember reading his piece with Dylan Riley on Bidenism and going, so he thinks Bidenism is Keynesianism that doesn't work, but somehow might work even though it doesn't have profits. I don't know how that works. But anyway. You reviewed 3 books, one of which I hate, one of which I think is misguided, and one of which I have not read, but the sections of it that I have read, I haven't read the whole thing, but I have read sections of the Derick book. It's actually the least bad of the 3, and I've read a couple more of these neo and techno-feudalism books, including some of the right-wing ones like Kotkin's. And I'll just admit my bias. In 2019, I actually flirted with this myself because I was trying to figure out the weirdness of profitability rates and quantitative easing, which is not a condition we live under anymore, but I was trying to figure that out. And ultimately, I rejected the idea of technofeudalism because I realized that my notion of capitalism was kind of ahistoric and almost libertarian. Like it was based off of this notion of pure commodity markets that had never actually existed. But I wanted to talk to you about this because your piece for American Affairs comes after This Is Everywhere. Like anything that talks about oligarchs on TikTok or Instagram right now, you go look at the comments and someone will scream accelerationism without understanding it and techno-feudalism. And maybe the other one is techno-feudalism of the Brolyarchy, which is the most awful Democratic Party portmanteau I've ever heard in my fucking life. But like, and I wanted to get, before we even get to what this is, why is this so popular right now?
Right. Well, firstly, thank you for having me on again. Always a pleasure. And secondly, we're intimate now. BungaCast, please. It doesn't need to be Alpha Bunga Bung. And then thirdly, I guess to answer the question, yeah, I mean, obviously there is a premium put in the intellectual world on coining new terms and being the first to call out the new thing. And I mean, that this has a very long history, but of course, as kind of intellectual production becomes ever more kind of commodified and engaged in the attention economy, it puts an even greater premium on having the sexy new term. Yeah, there's that. But that maybe doesn't explain why this term specifically. That just explains why there's an emphasis on coining new terms. I try to, so in my review essay, I tried to frame it in terms of how to describe decline, right? That's the first words, and it's how I begin the kind of conclusion to it as well. Because it's about describing decline or decay. And we can get into why one or not the other of those terms. There's some other Ds which I've discussed in terms of, disruption and disorder are the other two probably. And they're all different ways of trying to understand our world. So, decline generally comes from conservatives and reactionaries and kind of doing an Oswald Spengler kind of thing. And it's the decline of the West and it's the rise of China or, I don't know, Islam or something, whatever. All cases which are weak for different reasons. and they come attached usually with the same conservative politics, looking at those who are kind of draining the vitality of the body politic in the West. And it's usually women or gays or women, gays, or blacks. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so, and I think we can bracket that, but I think it's very important to try to have a materialist understanding of decline or what decline would mean. And maybe we can again discuss why decline or why decay. Disorder, it tends to be the preoccupation of kind of managerial centrist technocrats who are concerned primarily with geopolitical disorder and perhaps with the markets, right? I mean, you'll find this perhaps, I mean, in a more sophisticated version with Adam Tooze, but lots of other more less sophisticated version with like Ian Bremmer or people like that, kind of geopolitics
Yeah.
consult. Then you have disruption, which is, you know, generally actually taken as a positive. It's a recommendation. It's a it's a proposal from Silicon Valley types. Indeed, precisely the techno-feudal oligarchs, if we want to call them that, who push disruption as, you know, move fast and break things. That, you know, that kind of Mark Zuckerberg idea. So that doesn't really capture what's going on today. And decay is probably correct because it embraces both the decay of institutions of the 20th century, which we're dealing with, the decay of the neoliberal order, which is really advanced now, and perhaps future historians will already say that us human beings living in 2025, we're already in the order to come, and whether that's political capitalism or state capitalism or techno-feudalism remains to be seen. And also perhaps the decay of capitalism itself in terms of its own vitality, which is then a global matter. It's not, yes, Western capitalism, but Chinese capitalism is a-okay. I mean, on one level, yes, in terms of rates of growth, for example, and profit rates, but at a deeper level, probably not. So,
Although even the rates of growth for China have dramatically slowed. They're just way better than the rest, the
yeah,
West.
yeah, exactly. They're growing at 5%, and of course now in a much wealthier country, that means a great deal. But still, I think the point anyway beyond these 4Ds is that, you know, everyone is kind of grasping at a way of conceptualizing, at least in the West, and this applies. This is the cultural West, not just the political West. So it includes Latin America. And includes Africa maybe as well. I don't know, but whatever. These kind of conceptualizations, geographical kind of concerns aside, everyone's kind of talking about, look, greater inequality, oligarchy, um, new forms of control and surveillance, lack of dynamism economically, a reliance on rent seeking of some sort or another. So everyone's aware of these things, and this applies to mainstream commentators as much as it does to Marxists, and indeed as much to the kind of, you know, conservative right of various different guises, right? So everyone's kind of talking about the same things at a descriptive level. And I guess feudalism is just kind of this idea of total domination and is a way of kind of basically explaining our sense of unfreedom. Because it's, you know, the people talking about techno-feudalism, it's like, oh yeah, we're the serfs here. Right?
Right.
At most, you know, if you're a kind of a well-paid professional, you're an artisan who's being de-skilled or something. But you know, you're placing yourself in the feudal order as a kind of one of the unfree members. You know, no one's kind of going, this is techno-feudalism, and going, and I'm the king, or I'm one of the most powerful lords. And I think, you know, you can see other aspects, you know, at a kind of very superficial level, it's a tantalizing idea. And, you know, like, I was also kind of, when I first heard about it, like, yes, maybe that is what's going on. And you can look at the wasteful forms of consumption from the super wealthy and go, well, you know, that's exactly like feudal lords not having a way to productively reinvest. You know, there's no conception of that. And so you burn what you, I mean, burn, you know, I don't mean it like potlatch or something, but, you know, you unproductively consume it, or you waste it on war, right? And various forms of warlordism, the growth of criminal cartels, which erode state sovereignty. You know, all these things kind of seem kind of feudal, and you can kind of map one element on or another. And if you're very eclectic and have no pretense at historical accuracy or really kind of a great degree of intellectual coherence, you go, yeah, that's all kind of techno-feudal. And I guess that's why That's why it appeals. And I guess it's also a way of, you know, maybe fascism is tired now as a way of saying, oh, this is coming fascism. And so people kind of go, you know, feudalism instead. Yeah, it's exotic, right? I don't know.
But yeah, I mean, at least fascism had the benefit of being itself actually incoherent, which is part of why you can
Right.
apply it to everything. Whereas feudalism has its own historiographic problems. I mean, like the great debates right now is whether or not we should be talking. I mean, it's interesting that at the moment we're talking about this, if you're in liberal historical circles, the only people who even believe that feudalism is kind of still a category are like old British Marxists, like Wickham or the late Rodney Hilton or something. Um, and even they would tell you that feudalism is not one order. I mean, they would define it as manorialism, signory, polycentric social order, you know, these sorts of things. And I guess I would have to define that for normies. So manorialism is tied to a particular manner that develops out of the collapse of the Roman city system in the late antique period. Signory is like this system of oaths where you have interpersonal oaths that are basically functioning as state law. And polycentric order means there's multiple laws that are competing with each other that you could be subject to. And one of the things I find very interesting about today is I don't see any of that right now. I mean, I do see rents as a political economic form, and that's a feature of manorialism and signory, but only a feature. And I actually don't see a polycentric social order. I mean, like not yet, although who knows, at least in the United States, if the government stays shut down forever, maybe we will, but that's not happening yet. And then the other thing is
also that polycentric order is like of different orders of magnitude, right? I mean, you might have a city state, or you might have a small lord with his small holding. So it's not even like the U.S. breaking up and being all states, right? Because that those states are all of the same type and of the same kind. So, you know, the polycentric order of feudalism was something. And anyway, yeah, I mean,
yeah. You might have a city state, a vassal lord, and the church canon law,
right.
All of which can execute you. So, I think that's interesting. But I guess we could focus in on the 2 points where they're not completely off. Is rents and rent seeking as a dominant form of engagement, and something that your article doesn't mention. I don't know that the books I've read, like I said, I forced myself to read the Yanis Varoufakis book, but threw it across the room several times. I'm just going to admit that to you. I literally hurled my Kindle at the wall.
I had that more with Jody Dean's book, but as you can gather from what I write, but yeah.
Well, Jody Dean's book was interesting. I mean, you seem to get madder at Jody Dean's book, but also admit that it makes some more valid points than Yanis. Yanis seems to be the most popular because it's immediately understandable, but as being immediately understandable seems to be the most objectively wrong.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. I just hate the style of Jody Dean's argumentation and the, as you know, kind of eclectic approach to theory, which is like of a type, you know, it's kind of leftism in the pejorative sense of just like all this bad stuff, that's capitalism or the right doing it. And, you know, so I have a particular allergy to that kind of leftism. But I think what one last point, just before we get, I guess, onto the more substantial stuff, which I make in the review article, which is that the idea, this kind of notion of an undemocratic, completely hierarchical, integrated system of total domination and of completely unfree serfs who are not just exploited but extorted and subject to plunder and etc. Like, that's pre-democratic capitalism. And
Right.
the pyramid notion of, the king, that thing which I think is like a 19th century drawing of like the king, like we rule you, the priests like caste, like we delude you or something, the business people, the
Yeah,
merchants,
the thing the
like we extort you,
IWW
blah blah
still
blah.
likes for whatever reason. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, because it's subject to moralistic denunciation, right? So that's what makes it appealing, and that's what's appealing about techno-feudalism, because it's something unfair that's being done by capitalist own terms, right? It's unfair capitalism rather than fair capitalism. So, but the idea there anyway is that that's actually not feudalism, even if such a thing existed. It's not the tributary mode of production. It is pre-democratic capitalism,
Right.
and what we are living through now increasingly is post-democratic capitalism, even in formerly democratic states. And that's the analogy. If we want to draw something, would draw such an analogy is the one we should be drawing between 19th century capitalism and today, right? And so all this stuff which seems weird and new and bad to us is weird and new and bad from the perspective of the second half of the 20th century. So the point that I keep repeating, and I've made this point on Bunkcast a number of times, but we're living through not just the end of history, but the end of the 20th century and its forms, not just its content, but its forms. And that's, I think, the not understanding that is the root of a lot of derangement today and a lot of searching for historical analogies and terms to make sense of our world, but which are misguided.
It's one of the things I've liked about BungaCast, actually. We've agreed on this, and I've agreed on this with you guys actually for longer than I've been a Marxist. That we have been living through the long end of the long 20th century, and that most of our norms are actually misguidedly from about 15 years at the beginning of that, between the post-war consensus to about 1964 to 1968, depending on what you want to define as the breaking point. But like that's barely a generation, right? It just happens to have produced the largest generation that's currently alive. Well, actually, no longer. That's no longer true. It produced the longest generation that was alive until about 5 years ago. Now that it's significantly dying, I think millennials are actually larger. But that's not just true in the West. That's true kind of across the board, except in like North Africa and some places where birth rates are still really high, but birth rates have been declining everywhere. One of the problems that I have about the techno-feudalism argument is I can't tell how geographically determined it is, because when they talk about the West, sometimes it seems like they're talking about just the United States, and sometimes it seems like they're talking about Europe, Latin America, Anglo-North America, and maybe parts of Africa. Again, that's a big question mark. And also Africa also being the odd man out, as in 20th century conditions didn't really ever hold there that long. Anyway, so
yeah, and then China as well, because then the idea, particularly as it's tied to a notion of decline, and then China's rise, that China would carry on its wings this new social form, this new order, which would be techno-feudal. And then in some regards, you can go, yeah, because of course, probably state capitalism is its most advanced there. You can see it much more clearly. We had a recent episode with E.S. Halami on his excellent book on state capitalism, and I think it explains this very clearly as it being a general tendency, global tendency. But China obviously is where you want to see it most clearly, and then the social credit system and all the various forms of surveillance they have there, the lack of democracy, etc. It kind of makes a more compelling case for being, okay, if that's our future, then maybe that's the techno-feudalism that we're looking at. But again, as we've already said, it breaks down in the details.
Right. Well, I also don't know, like this particular version of the left stance on China, it seems particularly incoherent. I mean, like if you read Jody Gain, is China good or China bad? I actually wouldn't know from that book. And I don't know from her politics and her relationship to the PSL either. And I guess we should get into this. Maybe how did they define techno-feudalism versus neo-feudalism? Because this is a debate when I read Eugenie Morozov's discussion of this, he kind of didn't separate those two categories. And a lot of these people were criticized in that article, but the books weren't out yet. So then they seem to have responded to that and made a bigger distinction about the difference between the two categories. So what is techno-feudalism? What is neo-feudalism? And why even?
Yeah,
So,
I mean, between those two terms, I don't think there is anything. I mean, it tends to be the left-wing arguments, which are techno-feudalist because they focus primarily on Silicon Valley. Though, Joel Kotkin's book, which came out before any of these, and I interviewed him once back in 2019, and I mean, obviously he'd be classed as a conservative in the current U.S. landscape, but he says, "Oh, I'm an old social democrat," and that was immediately obvious from what he would argue, right? He's like a kind of 1950s, 1960s social democrat, and probably his divergence for the left comes from what his attitude is to development, to carbon capitalism, as it's called, to suburbs, things like this, right? And I don't care to get into that right now, anyway. But he also kind of he looks at California as his model, right? And Silicon Valley is quite important in that whole configuration. So anyway, all of this to say, I don't think there is a difference between techno and neo feudalism. They're kind of interchangeable terms. In any case, if we're trying to find a common thread to them, it is rentierism, I think, fundamentally, and the way that tech platforms have inaugurated new forms of rentierism and an anti-market kind of behavior or forms of extracting value. That's at the core of it, and then the account starts to differ as you go along, right? So as I write in the review, some bring kind of ideological elements to the fore, which I think are actually tend to be quite useful. The kind of breakdown of a common understanding, etc. Though again, you always have to go back and go, how is this like feudalism? So Jody Dean talks about the breakdown of the symbolic order, and in probably more popular terms, that would be understood as kind of the breakdown of consensus, post-truth. That's the other kind of prominent mediatic term, which is used to describe a similar phenomenon. And that's that's like, okay, that is going on, but also how is that related to the cosmology of a Christian feudal Europe, right? So there's all these ways that these things don't quite connect up, and so this is why I maybe Varoufakis's book is maybe the most wrong, but also the kind of most straightforward one, insofar as he really is willing to put his neck on the line and go and reduce it to kind of, no, rent is now more important than profit. Now, my issue, and I run this through the whole kind of review, which is that capitalism has always had elements of rent seeking in various different forms. In fact, those moments where capitalism is weaker, it has more dependence on the state. If you look at kind of Latin American history, there's been huge amounts of reliance on the state to go and expropriate at various, kick people off land, privatize public services more recently, all these different forms of or kind of led to fundary rentierism, right? Of just basically kind of agrarian capitalism. These have all been kind of features of capitalism in various points throughout its history. So the question isn't, when people point to the novelty of platform capitalism, the novelty seems to be in the technology, in the particular forms of mediation that the technology allows, rather than in the fact of there being monopolies, or in the fact of people being charged to work, right? Or charged to sell. Because there's been various forms of kind of anti-market behavior in capitalism. In fact, one thing which I didn't get a chance to kind of introduce into the argument, but Brodel always had this understanding of capitalism as precisely anti-market, right? So this association of capitalism and market is a kind of, is a kind of an element of classical political economy, which, as capitalism kind of develops, begins to lose the connection between to that kind of old form of market competition. as being central to capitalism. And so, for Brodel, basically, you have the kind of level of direct production of artisanship, of craft. You have the second level of market exchange, and that is an area where generally profit rates are very, very low because the competition is high, right? It's like people selling basic commodities, selling, lettuce at the market and stuff like that, right? And the level of capitalism, as you understand, has always been the realm of anti-market. It's been the realm of monopolies and monopsonies. And this is kind of the really looking over the longue durée. So again, there's a lot of presuppositions from the techno-feudal theorists and going, okay, there's something totally new happening, that they basically ignore the really existing history of capitalism and instead rely on a kind of ideal typical understanding, which is taken variously either from classical 19th century capitalism or from 20th century capitalism, depending on which element you want to focus on. So again, it's like it's people casting around, looking at these features of increased domination, increased inequality, oligarchy, maybe breakdown of sovereignty, and kind of casting around for a way of understanding this and having to reach for the pre-capitalist past, when the reality is actually forms of capitalism which have existed, but which have been particularly operative in the periphery, which is why I argue that and I'm following lots of Brazilian theorists who argue this, but that we're seeing the peripherization of the core, not so much something like techno-feudalism.
Right. Well, for me, I mean, this brings me to some of my frustrations with people who insist on like mid-century third worldism understanding of like, oh well, the core's proletariat isn't exploited, and I'm like, where you at? This is not the Fordist Social Compact of 1950 to 1960. It's just like that wasn't actually the greatest argument then either, but at least I understood it. Like now, insisting on it is weird. It seems to me that basically
and rests on a kind of globalized identity politics, effectively, right?
Right. Yeah. To me, it seems like this is a return to norms that the post-war social contract staved off. Actually, it's like that's actually the blip, not now.
Yes.
And in multiple ways. I mean, people will bring up the precariat and gig work, and I'm like, well, if you look at the 19th century before the establishment of formal labor, we've had this problem for a long time. Like in the United States in the 19th century, day labor relations were pretty common for American working class people. It just was a fact. Or even worse, you had outright company towns, which I do think, even though it's early capitalism, have a, to me, that like if you were to talk about semi-feudal elements of society, that's a real one. Like,
yeah, exactly. And those types of things still exist in actually quite advanced capitalism. I mentioned like the Gulf states and indentured workers, right? I mean, this is not you don't even have to look very far afield or to or deep into the past to find this stuff.
No, well, I mean, the Gulf states. It's funny. I when I was a mercenary educator and I would go wherever they paid me, the one place I would not go to was the Gulf states, because I'm like, well, you take my passport away and I can't leave. Like, unless you let me. Like, I don't like that. It's not like they had a strong history of like messing up elite labor like that, but they could, and which is like, I don't think so. And I think we see a lot more of that here. Gig work is, I mean, even Marx talks about this. Basically, the gig economy would be the way that most employers like to pay, period, because it treats labor as an even more variable cost. So that's not new either. And I think your point about the misunderstanding of feudalism, I honestly think this is like a broad point, and it's not unique to the techno-feudalist or neo-feudalist. I remember reading Hans Hermann Hoppe and Curtis Yarvin, the whole feudalism is capitalism, but better because it's totally private everything argument. And I remember going, well, that isn't feudalism, and your model for it is actually the early 15th century, which we have to admit is like a transitionary period to capitalism anyway. Like, you're not talking about the 9th century or something here.
Yeah.
So you just seem confused to me about like what these historiographic modes refer to. You mentioned Samir Amin and tributary modes of production. I found that essay that you cited very frustrating, because I'm like, are you arguing that everything except for socialism is basically always a tributary mode of production? And how does that help me understand anything then? Like,
no, but I think the argument here, I mean, and it's not his term. It's
no, it's
Wolf's
not.
term, I think. I can't
Yeah.
remember. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that's a way of kind of universalizing the pre-capitalist, pre-modern experience, right? Between kind of, within kind of civilization. So after hunter-gatherers, before capitalism, very long period over a huge range of different experiences, but tributary. Okay, I mean, I can live with that. And it's not, I don't know how useful it is, but I think at least it generalizes that experience in a way which doesn't rely on the very specific conceptions of what feudalism might have been. And again, probably not a mode of production. And if it existed in like parts of France and England in the 11th to the 14th century or something. So anyway, but I don't think the argument is one on that point specifically, right? Because people would be like, wait, hang on, I don't want to care about medieval history to make the argument that, okay, call it what you want then. It's like rent is everything now, and there's no more capitalism anymore. Because that's what this is about, right? It's things are declining, things are getting worse, things are getting less dynamic and less free, and they are, as I understand it, me, techno-feudal theorist, becoming post-capitalist, right? So even if we want to abandon the very iffy association to feudalism, then it's still about post-capitalism. And I think then the argument is, can't be about the historiography of like 14th century Europe, but it has to be about a clear understanding of what is going on today. And my point, and it's in the title of the thing that I wrote, it's total capitalism, right? That capitalism has vanquished the agrarian world, right? Of small subsistence production, of large landowners and kind of peasants working upon it, right? That's gone. Our agriculture uses actually very little labor nowadays, and so you have to kind of go to the least developed parts of Africa to really still find peasants in that form. It's taken conservatism with it and all the traditionalism that existed, and then it's defeated the internal enemy in terms of the proletarian socialism, and indeed even kind of the proletariat itself as a subject. And so, when you talk about kind of like, I don't know, capitalists getting away with shit, to put it in kind of very kind of vulgar terms, talk about capitalists getting away with shit. I mean, partly is the fact that there's no disciplining function exercised by the working class, or even kind of other kind of, if we don't want to reduce it to the working class, of kind of popular layers, organized in some form. It's that lack of kind of disciplinary function which leads to a lot of this stuff. And you could even make an argument that, like what Cory Doctorow calls enshittification, right, which is just a huge amount of kind of products and services just getting worse because they can. Part of that, I think, is a kind of, it's a kind of sort of vulture-like activity which they can get away with, even against kind of, relatively affluent consumers, because there's a lack of competition and there's a lack of kind of democratic pressure to kind of go, you're not going to get away with that kind of thing, right? We're just eating shit, right? And I think but that needs to be understood as total capitalism. This is what capitalism looks like, with no outside and no internal enemy either.
Well, I mean, this is the key point. The two things that I think that you have no external enemy really, because even if you don't think China is capitalist, which I don't know how you do that, but a lot of people don't. And if you don't, it clearly doesn't posit like a fifth international to fight the global capitalist order. BRICS is absolutely not that in any way, form, or fashion, and doesn't claim to be. Like, outside of a few people on the internet, no one is deluded about that. And I think even those people are becoming less deluded by the day.
Well, but the China love, I mean, I see this a bit in Brazil, right? And it's telling that it's in Brazil, right? Because there's
you
a
guys
kind
are
of
the B in BRICS. But go ahead.
Yes, well, there's that, but it's not about Brazil, because like no Brazilian has any illusions in Brazil,
Right.
unfortunately, which is part of the problem. But that's a story for another moment. It's kind of neo-Stalinism, and
Mhm.
and there's lots of kind of really big YouTubers and stuff here who are basically hitching their wagon to the China train, to mix my transportation metaphors, where they see China as some kind of opposition to the West, opposition to imperialism, opposite and some kind of new form of well, indeed, yeah, kind of form of socialism in some way, or at least that China is still in development towards socialism in the way that the West is not. And it's not by accident that, of course, it happens in a country like Brazil, which has no future, and no kind of sense of political direction or national project. And this probably applies also to kind of Eastern Europe as well, where the kind of Stalinist experience in its various derivative forms as well starts to look quite good as against capitalism. And this has not been so appealing in places like Britain or France, because there was still a degree of kind of genuine liberty, which was achieved under capitalist development, which and democracy, which would be safeguarded. And you say, well, Stalinism would require a great deal of trade-off, right? A great deal of unfreedom in exchange for education, housing, et cetera, right? So that doesn't sound like a good trade-off. But if you're somewhere like Brazil, and you live in kind of informal housing, you like informal labor markets, you don't have any protection, it's violent, and for you, kind of democracy doesn't really have a great deal of meaning, then kind of the Soviet Union circa 1960 starts to look kind of all right. It's not so much of a trade-off. It seems like a kind of gain relative to where you are.
Right.
And I think, and so anyway, that's about kind of Stalinist Russia. But I mean, the point is about I think that explains why China comes to be seen as not just a desirable option, but even as kind of socialist in some sense. And we have to kind of squint and pretend. But
Right. I find this this my favorite provocation that I do all the time is calling China the most responsible capitalist power to piss everybody off. So like,
yeah,
um, but I actually also kind of do believe it.
it probably
And
is, and it because in part because its elites are more concerned about their own legitimacy than
right.
the American political class, for instance, which is completely like they haven't done even the minimum of the obvious, which would be do a little bit of redistribution to try to sort things out. I mean, Biden's Build Back Better notwithstanding.
It's clear to me they're less given to it, despite the fact that the general population is more progressive, and that includes if the Democrats come back, like if they come back to power, like and I know that I'm told that I should be nicer to the Democrats these days, but my fellow leftist friends, but I'm just like, I you have to be careful with them, because if you actually look at their talking points, or who even shows up on MSNBC now, like, or excuse me, MS Now, or whatever the fuck it's called, um, it's like former neocons even more than progressive darlings who, they'll even say, we needed a taunt on Mamdani, but we're not really going to offer a strong social safety net at all. We'll offer some abundance, which is what we're getting now, light. a faux promise to return to neoliberalism under technological conditions, which, by the way, I mean, if I was to periodize neoliberalism, the tech oligarchy comes at the end of it not working anyway. Like the conditions of quantitative easing are the only thing that allow the accumulation of things like SpaceX and Tesla and Facebook to be profitable in the first place.
I mean, Varoufakis here at least is correct in saying that. Of course, he tries to create this whole new class of cloudalists, as he calls them, which sit above the capitalists and extort the capitalists. Even, so if you're a producer and you sell something on the marketplace and you sell something via Amazon, right? Amazon is going to extort you, which it does. I mean, and therefore you're the kind of victim in the story. As against these cloudalists, and even the end of cheap money, supposedly, according to Varoufakis, won't change anything because the cloudalists are entrenched. But I mean, yes, these are kind of new monopolists, but it hasn't fundamentally altered the relations of production.
No, I mean, which for me actually is one of the few things that gives me hope. But but this is because I'm like, well, you can't wealth transfer a market into profitability forever, period, end of discussion. So enshittification will only work for that so long. And that doesn't mean we won't have 1,000 bubble economies. I think one of the things though that I have to point out here is like, well, then that makes some of the things we were focused on during the Obama administration are like an early concern was about MMT, modern monetary theory applications to this, a little bit misguided in hindsight, which I think may be what's motivating Giannis here, if I'm completely honest, because he's never would say this is a self-critique, but it kind of feels like a little bit of a self-critique about earlier forms of Giannis thought. Because there was a sense that there was an argument by a certain group of MMTers post Warren Mosler that we could have our cake and eat it too and not alienate the big capitalists because we didn't need to tax them. That was the promise. And I'm always like, well, okay, even if that's monetarily true, and it may be, I mean, I'm not entirely convinced on that, but I'm open to it. It is clear that the government can't run out of currency. They print it, duh. I am still not convinced that the capitalists would have ever been okay with that. Because this is confusing power with just taxation.
Yeah. But there's another thing which I remembered. I mean, this is the point that actually a friend of mine in Brazil made to me, and I thought it was a very good observation, which is that at least the 3 techno-feudalists that I reviewed are all in some ways left populists. Right. So Varoufakis, very obviously, I mean, he was actually a key member of the one left populist party or attempt to actually get into power. Right. So that's very obvious. Cédric Durand is a France Insoumise guy. So Mélenchon's grouping. And Jody Dean, okay, maybe the link is less strong there, but I'm sure she was a Bernie supporter.
She was. Yeah. I mean, before she got involved with the PSL, she was the Party for Socialism and Liberation. She was definitely in that mold. She was. Although, I mean, Jody Dean also, she rejected tenets of classical Marxism pretty early. Her theory on feudalism actually kind of matches with her theories of she used to call it commutative capitalism, undoing the labor theory of value. And I'm just like, okay, that's a long-standing thing for her.
But anyway, the point is that techno-feudalism kind of maybe, especially as these theories kind of start emerging in 2019, 2020, act maybe as an alibi for left populist failure. I don't know, this is always speculative, and I guess you can't go too far and just going, this is your personal political failing, which you leverage into theoretical reflection. I don't know. But, to a certain extent, encountering a world which feels obdurate, difficult to change, no political traction, huge degree of unfreedom and domination, that suddenly that comes into view as soon as the kind of promising political prospect of left populism disappears off the face of the earth effectively. I don't know.
Well, I think that I mean, this is implied. You don't state that outright, but it's implied in your essay that a lot of these people want their social democracy back, if not left populism. And
I mean, everybody wants their social democracy back. This is the other thing. I mean, everyone. One can.
I would like it if it was possible.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. And you can have your individual exclusions, but when I say everyone, I mean the general everyone. The point is that I mean is that, like, across the political spectrum, right? Everybody wants their social democracy back. The populist right yearns for it. I mean, they might look at it in a very fetishistic form, having kind of have Coca-Cola back or something. I don't know what that some MAGA types are like. I don't follow this stuff closely enough, but they look at the kind of symbolic aspects of the post-war settlement. They just focus on different elements. So they'll look at kind of greater racial homogeneity, gender, more traditional gender roles, etc., and emphasize that aspect. The left will focus more on the existence of trade unions, of good jobs, maybe even the kind of types of revolts against social democracy, which came from the left, which is the form of the new left in a way. But anyway, the point is that one, we still take the 20th century, and particularly the second half of the 20th century, as the norm.
Mm-hmm.
So the experience of Western countries from 1945 to 1973, or maybe even through to 1990, as the historical norm, and therefore see the new as being necessarily some weird exotic thing like techno-feudalism, and are all secretly wishing to kind of go back to that previous form. Or not so secretly, I mean, maybe the left is a little, certainly like the left in Britain has been much more, I think, explicit and upfront about, like, oh, we want to kind of rebuild social democracy in some form or another. I mean, that's what the left in the UK has been doing for 40, 50 years in different forms. But the point I'm making is that, in a way, everybody's kind of yearning for that. So even the kind of centrist liberals who bemoan, kind of post-truth, for example, the lack of faith in institutions, the growing distrust in each other and institutions, the lack of respect for professionals, for journalism, et cetera, right? All these kind of very New York Times types of, or even New Yorker types of complaints look back to the 1950s, 1960s of the world of consensus. So left, right, and center, everyone's kind of wanting to go back to that. I mean, and it makes sense because it was, in a way, a better world, or at least a world which, even from a kind of a radical perspective, was still a world where there seemed to be greater exit ramps, more exit ramps than what we have now. So across the board, everyone's kind of nostalgic for that. I mean, and I'm sure we're agreed that there's no going back to that.
No, I mean, it's based off of World War II happening.
Yeah, I mean and that's exactly. I mean, that's the condition of possibility for it: war and the threat of revolution, and that's the only way it would be coming back. And I mean, sadly, that's probably the most plausible one, though we might all be dead after that. So
yeah, I was going to say, war with nuclear armed drones and mass chemical weapons is not one led by robots is not really one that I want to wish upon anyone. I mean, in that sense, Peter Thiel is despite his AGI god and everyone who criticized it being the Antichrist illusions, he is slightly more concerningly realistic about the humanity-ending possibilities of this. And, I mean, he just doesn't care. Whereas there's a lot of other talk about this where I'm like, if you got your early 20th century back, the death toll would be much higher than the early 20th century, and it was pretty high then.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know. I think it would come as a surprise. I think it would always, come as a surprise. It's possible there'd be complete nuclear annihilation. It's possible that because of the various kind of bottom-up disaggregated forms of warfare that you can have now, that everybody can have a drone or whatever, it would be highly chaotic, but not, maybe it wouldn't be weapons of mass destruction. I don't know. And I'm not a kind of warfare theorist, but
yeah, I don't know either, but neither one of them are conditions for social democracy.
Yeah, let's just and none of them are desirable as well. So let's just
and there's some things implied in your discussion that I actually want to pull out and make more explicit. One of the things that you talked about the inability of labor to do this, and I want to talk to people about why. It is not just the voluntaristic failure of the labor movement. And this has been like my argument with some, let's say, damage and Jacobin people who kind of talk like the labor movement failed in the 1980s because Reagan convinced us all that it was bad. And my response to that is like, how do you have effective labor unions in shops that are 20 people in the service sector that even if you shut down every single Starbucks is not going to fundamentally change the economy? And that, yes, there are still choke points, but those choke points are in logistics, which have their own problems, and then highly automated manufacturing, of which I'm not sure that the workers leaving would actually be that huge of a threat. And those two things make the traditional organizing forms of the 19th and 20th century left really, really difficult to do. And it's not about popularity. As Ben Fong is actually quite good on this when we talk about, labor has seen a resurgence in popularity all over the world, and in very few places, if any, have we actually seen a growth in the labor movement. Furthermore, and I think this is the other thing that your article points this out, Marxist-Leninists point out, communizers pointed out, and it's unfortunately true. The mass mobilizations for national liberation projects were actually peasants. And what do you do when you don't have a viable peasantry outside of the most rural parts of India and Africa, like at all? It's like you have an urban informal proletarian economy, in most of the developing world, and increasingly in the developed world. Exactly, this whole like protracted people's war argument, not dealing with the technological barriers that we just talked about, is also hard because you don't have that social subject either. And I'm not saying there's no reason to hope, but I think you kind of, to steal a phrase from Benjamin Studebaker, you have to give up hope here to have any, because your hope is based on things that don't really exist anymore.
No, I that's right. I mean, one can maybe say that there's an analogous situation between our kind of petty bourgeois condition and that of the peasantry. But anyway, that's again making analogies which confuse matters more than clarify. But yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you that that organized labor, doesn't have leverage because it's not just a choice. It's not, even if you understand outsourcing to China, etc., as a political choice, to a certain extent, neoliberalism wasn't just merely a choice. It was a response to a profitability crisis, which couldn't just be kind of wished away, or like you couldn't have just continuity Keynesianism and social democracy. I don't think that was realistic. Not that every aspect of neoliberalism was predetermined and had to happen, but nevertheless, and capital learned as well. It had moved from concentration of labor to dispersal. So even where you do have factories, they're in far-flung areas. They're not in kind of big cities. They're all dispersed from one another. And the simple fact of like less need for living labor in manufacturing, and then in services you just don't have these big groupments of people in the same way that you did before. So that's all. It just casts us all into a situation of maybe not even citizens, but subalterns, and suggests that the only form of struggle today is a directly political one, right? That those 19th and 20th century forms of social struggle, they're not to be kind of discarded entirely or anything like that, but and certainly in areas like logistics, perhaps could have much more impact than their relative weight suggests. But yeah, I mean, I think the only kind of politics left kind of available to us is a directly political one. The issue again comes back to one of what forms of organization would allow for that to happen, because precisely that kind of forms of dispersal and atomization and so on have prevent these things from forming, and the kind of sense of immediacy and flux prevents any form of durable organization. So we're back to these sorts of problems, and ultimately of kind of rebuilding society, rebuilding forms of sociability, than we are about considering how to rebuild the labor movement, which has this kind of retro quality to it, which is I mean, it's not going to happen. Certainly not in not in the 20th century form. And it wasn't even that good in the first place, right? I mean, radical kind of all the radical critics were against that, or pointing to its limitations.
Well, I mean, I'm going to bring up a movie, and I apologize if you have not seen it. I was thinking about Paul Thomas Anderson's One Battle After Another, which is based off in quotation marks, Vinland by Thomas Pynchon. And it occurred to me watching that movie that one of my frustrations with the movie is like it's supposedly, I guess, set in the future, or at least the now, but it's about a left that is 30, 40 years before you can't convince me that that's a millennial left that's doing the kind of stunts that didn't work for the new left, but we're definitely new left stunts. I mean, we're talking about the Weathermen and whatnot. And I say that because the kind of disavow, but also over-identification with the new left seems to be everywhere today, and that may be part of the novelty of this theory. Because even liberals somehow identify. I mean, like, you got liberals identifying with the Weathermen, which may be appropriate, but like whatever. But it seems like I was arguing with some people on the internet about like the Weathermen success, and they were talking about the success of the bombing campaigns, and my only response was, okay, after we factor out they got better and quit blowing themselves up after they killed 3 to 4 of their own members, what goal did those bombings achieve again? I got no answer, none. And I was like, that just doing a thing is not a criterion for success, right? And it occurred to me that that's the imagination of a lot of the left today, that like even doing anything, even if it had no goal and completely failed on any programmatic or ideological bases and led to the thing now, is seen as somehow good in a lot of people's eyes because there's no vision for this.
I mean,
go ahead.
It's basically narcissistic. I hate to kind of have recourse to that term, but it's about how it makes you feel more than what it achieves. Ultimately, that's why, if you want to really boil it down, I'm in two minds about this, right? So we've discussed on BungaCast, and I've written about this as well, about how we're living through finally the end of the 1960s. And I think we're in a transitional moment. So on the one hand, I agree with you that we are still in the shadow of the new left, and that a lot of politics remains focused on the kind of narcissistic forms of self-expression, of finding yourself through activity. The whole woke thing is still, is basically the long tail of the 1960s, and its struggles around race, class, and gender. Of course, transmuted through kind of 1980s neoliberalism and becoming incredibly bureaucratic, right? As wokeness was, and still is. I saw a post from Bluesky the other day. I was like, wow, this stuff's still going on over there. Because
yeah, it's weird. I feel like I'm magically
back
when I
to,
go over there, I'm like, oh,
like 2020 here.
It's eternally 2015 to 2020 is even a little late for it. It's like,
right. Yeah.
It's like back when everyone was in the first resistance to Trump mode, and also we would cancel anybody for anything, including stuff that didn't happen.
Yeah. No, it's bizarre. It's bizarre. Anyway, but so still the focus on kind of identities, intersectionality, the emphasis on voluntaristic action, direct action. We can think of other ways of other elements of the new left. I mean, focus on kind of cultural hegemony, ultimately a concern with what people are thinking and deep down what they really feel, right? So ultimately you want to change people, not change the world. These are all elements of the kind of new left's legacy. On the other hand, I think we're transitioning out of that world as the boomers themselves die off. And I don't want to just reduce it to the fact of the boomers carrying it through, because Gen Xers kind of carried it through. Millennials did too. And I think maybe Gen Z are going to be the first post-60s generation, and post-new left generation. I don't know. I can't recall now the kind of specific examples I used to make this case, but I wrote in the BungaCast newsletter about the end of the 1960s. So I'm in two minds about this. Maybe we'll start to see kind of different forms emerge. I don't know whether that's optimistic or not, but at least it'll be new.
Well, my thesis on Gen Z is that they're going to be the spaghetti against a raw generation of ideologies, which is why we're going to see like some truly bizarre shit. I think when people are like MAGA communism so weird, I'm like, you haven't seen nothing. Like, for one, we kind of saw that in a smaller amount in Generation X. Actually, like I am of Gen X age. I remember weird ideologies emerging all the time in the early 1990s. I was young then because I'm like literally the youngest Gen Xer you can be, but still, I do remember it. And two, I think this people have been trying to cast Gen Z in a clear political trajectory wrongly for a while. One is it's not as homogeneous as millennials, and millennials aren't that homogeneous either. As I like to remind people, in 2005, people were predicting that millennials were going to be the most conservative generation in history. Just to remind people of that.
And maybe they were, maybe we were, but not in the way that was expected.
Right, exactly. Like we were conservative in a radically liberal way.
Yeah.
Yes, I do think,
or maybe just of the kind of having very naive hopes of people being good,
oh God,
and being virtuous and whatever, and then being disappointed with the reality that it wasn't. I mean, I think, as an aside, actually, no, here's a point about specifically in relation to what we're talking about, right? A lot of political conflict today, one of the axes, but I think about which people aren't really conscious of, is about post-materialists versus materialists. And I don't mean materialists in a Marxist sense or even Feuerbachian sense or anything like that. I mean, the way that Engelhardt talks about it, for example, kind of talks about post-material values, more concerned with self-expression, with about rather than kind of survival. And I think, to put it in a kind of reduced form, there's a expectation amongst, primarily amongst kind of middle class liberal millennials, for example, to pick the kind of clearest expression of it, that in fact politics and society isn't about struggle, that life isn't necessarily, the life isn't struggle, that life can somehow be primarily about leisure, primarily about finding yourself, and that political progress and social progress can be achieved without really breaking any eggs, that it can be a kind of smooth process. And both the kind of conservative populist right, I mean, they're probably the biggest agents of kind of going, no, things are hard and difficult and we need war. Of course, I don't want to endorse that because it's a Schmittian vision of just kind of perpetual conflict with no higher order principles and no real sense of progress. It's just, it's politics reduced to war. But they at least reintroduce a kind of idea that, I guess, of struggle into society. And whereas the post-materialists kind of still persist on this idea that we can live on thin air, that production happens elsewhere, that friction, even in social relations, is something which one can try to remove, or even labor under the pretense that friction isn't necessary, right?
Right.
And I think that seems to be like at the root of a lot of not just conflict, political conflict, but of kind of misrecognition.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in that regard, like the archetypal, millennial middle class liberal would be someone who would still be living in the legacy of this long legacy of the 60s in a way, but particularly as it took shape at the end of history, right? And then there's people who are still in some ways kind of living in the end of history, and there's other people who are very much not.
Right. Well, I think this is important. I think it's important to think about like the mass. I mean, we could talk about the PMC and all this, and you know my critiques of it actually. But one thing I'll give it is that what we saw from the 1960s to the to the 2020s, basically, was the idea that you could semi-professionalize everything through education. And that education was its own social good for its own sake. This even shows up in postmodern theorists like Foucault. Knowledge is power. No, it isn't. Power is power, fucker. Knowledge can be used for power, but if you don't got no guns, I don't care how much you know. And
that language games can effectively somehow change reality.
Oh God, yeah. Like if
the kind of constructionist bias, basically. Yeah,
but it's a weird constructionist bias too, though, because if like you threw Ian hacking at these people, they'd also freak out, which I think I'm going to actually do, and point out that like, oh, all your because there's a strategic essentialism everywhere. Where like, oh, everything's constructed except the categories I really care about, which is not, which I will say constructed, but I will also treat immutably and can never change ever. So we have the multiracial Reich of the Democrats coming, which I've always, my critiques, that never was true. It was never going to happen that way. Like that treated
like demographic determinism.
And it's static too. Like I'm like, okay, so you actually start providing material goods to people. Why do you think they're always going to vote with the progressive coalition of the Democrats then? What? I don't really see how this works, friend. But all that aside, I mean, I think your point at techno-feudalism, I also think we have to be careful about saying we know why people did something. But it's very convenient right now to be like, well, we never could have won anyway, because really the lords have come back. And I'm like, well, if you never could have won anyway, why aren't you criticizing yourself for picking the wrong battle?
Yeah.
Like,
and why didn't we even see that confrontation actually happen? I mean, other than the fact that oligarchs obviously weighed in on politics, but I mean, that's again a kind of a piece with a certain millennial naivety where, as we've discussed before, there's this kind of expectation that, like, the struggles within the Labour Party that happened in the UK, that well, look, we're all part of the same party, so the Corbynites can win over the centrists ultimately. They're not going to, centrists aren't going to totally sabotage us. Well, yeah, they will. I mean, there's different interests there, right, exactly. And that's okay. There are interests in the world and they are conflicting, and we could be honest about these, not try to smuggle everything in under some notion that that we have some consensus or some shared values or something that we can work from.
Yeah, well, I to bring this back to the point of maybe something that ironically isn't feudal but is kind of interesting, is a lot of what people are brushing against with social friction is the realization that class origins and class both exist, and those aren't the same thing either. Like, I think about the way I was trained to talk in university, which is a neutral, non-offensive way of speaking, but also hides everyone's origins. If you speak it, you don't know where you're from. You don't know where you're from both geographically, and you don't know where you're from in the social hierarchy, except for the acknowledgement of race as kind of like a disability cap that we have to acknowledge, but then also pretend don't have their own internal contradictions, classes, or whatever, because then you can't do stuff like say that affirmative action to Harvard is going to fix racial problems in America, when, you know, some of that affirmative action quota is being met by accepting students from Nigeria. And in fact, you know, or even like a dirty secret here is that the more we push DEI projects, and I mean DEI specifically, not just civil rights projects, we actually saw a defunding of a lot of things that the colleges did with like urban poor Black kids. Like it really was an elite washing movement, and that was why it wasn't that hard to get people from various social classes, not a majority, but enough to turn against it. And it is very hard to convince people in the cores of American radicalism, which also happen to be the cores of American finance, the two coastal cities, that this is true for the rest of the country. It really is. I mean, I have friends of mine who I talk to on a regular basis who don't understand that, like, yes, people cared about not attacking, I don't know, your trans workers. They did care about that. But no, there were not mass pushes for DEI from the unions in red states. That did not exist. It didn't happen. Even if they didn't have a problem with certain protections for people, as long as you didn't get too uppity about like trying to change things through language codes. And that is, you know, because that ideology, I mean, people say, oh, well, the liberal activist class dominated. No, the liberal activist class also dominated a lot of the key thinkers of general society, not just the Democratic Party, because we pushed everyone through the university system and made it to where progressive politics was somehow completely dependent on that. And I don't, there literally seems to be no answer for that. Just, I mean, even people who I kind of like, I like Doug Himwin a lot, but when he was talking about the fall of trust in institutions in America, I'm like, one, it's not unique to America, and two, you should blame the institutions too, just not talk about how Americans are stupid.
Right.
Like, like it, I don't know who you're winning over except yourself. Like, you know,
And this is and even the centrality of the university to left-wing politics, which again is a story from the 60s onwards, really, is itself maybe coming to a close. Because and that's good. You know, I mean, obviously the attacks on universities, you know, it's particularly the kind of Trump's attacks on are not good.
They're bad.
And,
I'm not happy about it. But.
Yeah. And you know, if there's less funding for higher education, that's not good. But you know, that's of a piece with their marketization, et cetera, et cetera. That's a whole, anyway, it's a whole other story. But you know, if the left has to find some other redoubt, that's fine, you know. Or you know, ideally that there would that whole whole idea of what we understand to be left disappears, right? Because you know that it was part of the problem.
Ironically, one of the funny things about this, ironically, just occurs to me right now, the academy before it was marketized is actually one of the few semi-feudal institutions actually left in Western life.
Right.
So, like,
yeah, that's true.
We're like, but we're talking about techno-feudalism at the expense of one of the only feudal institutions that still exists, other than, like, I don't know, the Catholic Church. So, the irony has just never occurred to me till this exact moment.
That is good though. Yeah, it's certainly like Oxbridge or something. You know, it's like
right. Well, I know you don't have a ton of time today, Alex, and you'll be back on, and people should definitely check out what you guys are doing over at Bungercast. But you know, you ended with a moment of kind of what I would call dark hope, which is hope, but it's hope of the, we might say the Benjamin Studebakerian kind, where it's like if we admit that our attempts here are a problem, to like bring back the 20th century or hold on to it. And I mean, I admit the irony with millennials is we're holding on to a 20th century that we barely fucking existed in. I mean,
Yeah.
like we existed in the vapor.
And we got the bad version of the, we got the kind of peak neoliberalism
Right.
and after, like, yeah.
Right. I mean, like, it's like peak neoliberalism and then whatever the fuck the post-aughts were. I mean, like, it's like, ugh, gross. You don't even get the cool pop culture of the 80s and 90s decay period or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and that's at the root of the stupid generational politics, which is like, you boomers used up all the resources and screwed up the world for us, and you shouldn't have pensions because or whatever, like, which is just a reactionary politics. But yeah.
Well, I mean, to be fair, the boomers that are probably still alive don't. So, well, I mean,
It depends where you are. Yeah.
It depends where you are. But like in the United States, there is a middle dividing line of boomers on pensions, and we are now past that. Like,
Right.
and Gen Xers, I mean, Zoomers will call me a boomer, which is hilarious. But Gen Xers, the older ones, are now approaching retirement in the next, I think 5 years, and they don't have anything like enough to retire. And I mean, I was talking to someone about, and this is like, I get why this leads to the techno-feudalism thing, but there's two horrifying proofs about at least the US economy right now. If AI is profitable, it means we have a post-job society. But luckily, AI is unlikely to be profitable, in which case we have a no-growth society, which is also pretty bad. Because it's not just that there's no immediate growth once you factor out not just AI, literally server center creations for the AI. So if you don't invent digital God soon, then you have a massive boondoggle of one of the most wasteful investments that have ever existed in human history. And with no clear out as to what's going to come after it at all. There's not a clear technology horizon even after this exactly, if it's not as productive as predicted, and it doesn't look to be at the moment. I'm not saying AI is useless. I don't think that, but like it's not leading to the massive productivity gains or anything that they said that they were
No,
supposed
I
to
mean, that's
do.
the thing. It's disruption. There certainly will be. I mean, and that's entirely leaving aside all the decivilizing, desocializing, dehumanizing aspects of it. We never saw the big productivity gain from ICT, in the first place, or maybe it just compensated for otherwise declining productivity. But anyway, the stories of stagnation. I don't know if AI will do that. But lots of people will be made unemployed.
Either way,
Paralegals and
yes,
lots of professionals basically who white collar jobs and so on.
Yeah, very specific white collar jobs. Though, think that white collar jobs that are based on throughput are pretty much gone. I think we have to deal with that. The other thing that we have to deal with is the and this is more true for the U.S., but maybe it's true for a lot of the world. I actually haven't looked at all the stats. It's not true for Brazil, I'm sure, but this idea that we can float the economy off of healthcare spending and care work, that is also based on massive wealth transfer and also massive inefficiencies, like in the United States in particular. We have a worst of birth world system. Like, I've lived in a place that had a true no insurance free market, Egypt, that just there was nothing. And I've lived in places with socialized medicine. They're actually both more efficient than what the US has.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to be poor in the Egyptian one, but I don't want to be poor here either, nor do I want to be middle class here. In fact, I think I have to be really, really fucking rich for this not to be a constant existential threat to me. And yet, all jobs growth has been in that area. And particularly if you're not highly skilled and professional, if you think about Gabe Winant's work about the wives of former industrial area things, it's all not just in nursing, but also billers, clerks, all that stuff. And frankly, if you had a rational healthcare system, you'd probably have the nurses, but a lot of the other supplementary positions would not exist because they exist to facilitate communication.
These things are all incredibly top heavy. That's why that's the problem, and that goes for supposedly socialized systems, which aren't, but something like the NHS, which is the single most socialized medicine in the world, as a form of organization, but of course it's extremely marketized. That is extremely top heavy, right? It's a lot of administrators, a lot of pencil pushers. So even a rationalized system would lose all of that. And you might have more nurses and so on. But, again, I even hinted this in the conclusion of the techno-feudalism thing, that Jody Dean is an advocate also of the kind of, care-based, I don't know, economy or whatever. And it's premised on a notion that there is nothing left to build and to be done, right? That there is no kind of developmental trajectory in the future. And if you're not pushing for that, then and really just want a kind of settling of accounts on the present, just a redistribution of the present, I'm afraid that isn't going to win people over. I don't think that's much of a vision. I don't think it's also going to be possible either. Certainly not within a kind of capitalist economy. So,
and it's not going to deal with it also won't deal with the stuff they think it'll deal with, like as I've talked with people, if you want to do a green world that's more fair to the developing world, blah, 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 at least at the beginning, it's going to require massive infrastructure investment.
Yeah.
The likes of which we have not seen since probably World War I. It's possible, and it could even be non-growing after you set it up, but you gotta set it up.
Yeah.
And that will require massive throughput. You can't have a bunch of teachers and nurses do that, unfortunately. I mean, I say this as a teacher. I think one of the things that amuses me about this, and you tell a lot of these people are college professors and not high school teachers. As a high school teacher, I do not want all of society to be run like my fucking job. Like that would be a nightmare. But that seems to be the model that the best model any of these people can come up with is like mid-tier bureaucratization as the eternal socialist model. I'm like, I can't get anyone to fight for that. What do you want? Like, no one wants that. The people who are in it don't really want it. Like, no, But anyway, so to end on your dark hope, where do you think we should start looking? Because one thing that you imply is like we do have to look for new things. We're gonna have to look for a new, directly political confrontation with this. And so what is that for you? That's my last question, by the way.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, on one level, I think trying to reinitiate a sort of national project on a kind of popular basis is not a bad start. Now, for reasons we've discussed, a lot of that isn't really possible, but you have to start pushing, right? And I think this is not a stagist idea, and I certainly don't have anything as developed and thought out as a stagist idea. And stagism is wrong anyway, because through acting, you change the conditions on which you're acting upon. So, you don't arrive at stage 2 in the way that you planned, because history happens. Things,
right.
So that it's not that. But the point is, you have to start creating the conditions, I guess, for politics. And so to start thinking about it kind of, I don't think that the kind of some elements of left populism, I think, were good. Probably Bernie Sanders is probably the best form of it, certainly in terms of the things that he was calling for, the type of rhetoric and communication. Where it fell down and made it the worst type of left populism was because it saw no avenue other than the Democrats to go and pursue that. So, that's where the kind of contradiction lied. But, I don't think that sort of politics is completely wrong. There's this piece by Perry Anderson where he discusses kind of populism and why to think in kind of much more directly political terms and kind of really about more the immediate present, that populism hasn't been able to really deliver on its promise because it's been hived off into left and right variants. And Bernie Sanders probably came closest to breaking through that, I think. Whereas a lot of the left populists remained too leftist, right? or to use Anton Jaeger's phrasing, too left and too populist. There were too populist in their forms of organization, which is to say too leader-based, too ephemeral, etc., and too leftist in terms of still only speaking to kind of left-wing niches. A genuine kind of populism which was able to evade the capture by existing left and right kind of institutional forces would need to be able to speak against oligarchy and be able to offer something, have an answer at least to the kind of migration question, which is the third rail of Western politics today. You know, in a way which is be able to put things on its head, which is really to fundamentally treat it as an economic and political matter, not as a cultural one. But you know, that might be the start of a kind of a national, of some sort of kind of national project, the discussion of politics on those grounds. And that applies also to somewhere like Brazil, where it might say, okay, where are we going? You know, because I don't think we can start from, I have to start on a kind of popular basis, not on a working class or proletarian basis specifically, because I think that assumes too much in terms of forms of organization, in terms of class consciousness, all these things which aren't present today. And then you know, and the kind of ideological realm of kind of dreaming big, of kind of speaking to people's ambitions, not just as victims, right? That we can build a better world, get things done. You know, there's the basic thing that I think a lot of kind of politicos and intellectuals don't understand, which is a lot of kind of normal non-political people's kind of, why would you vote for someone like Donald Trump, or why would you vote for Erdogan or whatever? It's like, well, because the guy's decisive and he gets things done, you know. And I think a lot of kind of political intellectuals underestimate the kind of simple appeal of that. And that isn't to say that we should endorse some sort of demagogic populism, no, and very much on the contrary. But you know, there's an element for kind of making big claims and trying to, not in a kind of leftist guise, but really like, no, we're going to build stuff. We can build stuff. We can get things done. I think that's the only way to kind of confront the fundamental cynicism of the age.
Yeah. I think it's a good place to, and I would agree. I mean, I've been on what I would like to call neo-workers politics, but I have to admit that I've run up against the same things that we've talked about. Like, the unions are what they are. The professional unions and the work and the like blue collar unions have very different aims and goals. The blue collar unions are basically decimated. They, you know, outside of the Teamsters or whatever, and it's no one who follows anything thinks the Teamsters are particularly left wing. And you know, and worldwide, I think there's a lot of like, oh, this is just an American problem, and I like no, it's unfortunately not. It's actually, it seems more terminal in the UK than it does here.
Yeah, no, and US kind of looking fondly over the Atlantic, and like, oh, maybe we can do Nordic, blah blah blah. Come on, that's in crisis. It might just not be as advanced as the US because it was starting from a higher level, but you know, it's fucked too. There's no model out there to be found somewhere else.
Right. Yeah. I would agree with you on that. Where can people find your work, Alex? I mean, you've been on the show before, and we've obviously talked about BungaCast, but where else can they find your work?
Well, yeah, principally on BungaCast. I write for American Affairs, and I'm currently working on a book on peripherization, on lessons from the B side of the West. So I hope to bring that to light in coming times because I can't set a deadline on that. But yeah, also we have the kind of BungaCast Substack. I've got my own Substack as well, which I don't write for often enough. But I would also like to invite you on to BungaCast. Long overdue. Maybe we could talk about literacy or contemporary illiteracy, which I know is a concern of yours. So
yeah, that's a concern of mine. It's something I actually study for my day job.
Yeah. So. let's do that. Let's do that soon. I'll send you an email.
Sweet. All right. Take care.
Okay. Nice one. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.